Hello and welcome back to the channel. First up, welcome to all the new subscribers and big thanks to everyone who's liked and commented on the videos I've posted so far. Really glad you've been enjoying them. It's been a couple of weeks since my last video because I've been busy sorting out a little album for Bandcamp which has some of the best bits of the January videos I posted last month. There's a link to that down in the description. Anyway, today I want to talk about 8-step sequences, which are a pretty common sight in modular. On the surface these seem pretty simple. 8 steps doesn't sound like a lot compared to all the other kinds of sequences that are out there, but with a bit of creative patching you can get a lot more out of them than you might think. So in this video I'm going to run through 8 patches that explore a few different techniques which will hopefully spark a few ideas of your own. There's a timing index down below, so feel free to skip through to the bits you're interested in, but first, here's a quick preview of what's coming up. So before we get into the patches, I'm just going to explain what I'm using today. This is the Xaoc Moskwa II. They call it a roto-sequencer because the steps are arranged in a circle. On the surface it's pretty simple. Every time it gets a clock pulse it advances one step. Each step has a knob which sets the CV. Normally that would be sent to the pitch input of an oscillator or a sound source because it's quantized. So you can set the pitch with that. You can quantize it to one of 8 scales. You could of course use that to sequence anything else that you wanted to modulate in your system. It doesn't have to be notes, but most commonly is for sequencing melodies. There's a gate output for each step which you can toggle on and off with these buttons. And there are 3 knobs in the middle. This one here, the rate knob, if you're using the internal clock, is basically the tempo control. If you're using an external clock, then it will multiply or divide that. So you can go up to ×8 or divide by 16 for the speed. The reset knob is essentially the length of the sequence. It determines which step it will play up to before it starts back at number 1 again. And the range knob sets the CV range for the knobs, so from 0 to 1 volt or 1 octave at the bottom up to 8 octaves at the top. There's a bunch more advanced features under the hood here as well. You can introduce a couple of different types of randomness to the step order. You can add slew or glide in between the steps. You can set a pattern of up to 8 gates on each step, which is good for adding ratcheting effects or more complex rhythms. You've got CV control over the start-stop, the reset and the direction. So I'm not going to do an in-depth tutorial on how to use all the advanced features of the Moskwa today, but I might do another video on it in the future once I take delivery of the Oscillator Kino 2 expander. This opens up even more possibilities with CV inputs for loads of other functions. Although I'm going to make use of some of the Moskwa specific features in some of these patches today, most of the things I'm using are pretty widely supported by other sequences, so hopefully you'll get some ideas from these patches no matter what you're using. So without any further ado, let's start making some noises. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about today is polymetric patterns. What that means in a nutshell is where you have more than one pattern looping, playing at the same time, but each loop is a different length, so they don't line up perfectly each time they repeat. For example, if you have a 5-beat loop and a 7-beat loop, they would line up every 35 beats, so that's the common multiple of them. What I've got playing is rings, playing a simple rising arpeggio that the Moskwa's playing, and I've actually recreated that on a channel of the BeatStep Pro as well, which is playing a second voice. So if I fade that in, hear that on its own. So if we play them together. Now if I reduce this Moskwa sequence from 8 steps to 7, we start to get some nice interlocking, overlapping going on. Can go a bit shorter again. And at this point they've come back into sync again. So what I've got here is the Moskwa displaying a simple ascending minor scale. It's playing the square wave of the Xaoc, which is going through the AR synthesis filter over here. I've also synced up the BeatStep Pro, and on the sequencer channel here, I've just got the gate output connected to the direction input on the sequencer. Basically, whenever that gets a gate or a trigger, it will reverse the direction of play. So I'll put these two direction changes in, so it'll play 8 steps, then it'll reverse direction and play them backwards. So you've got this kind of pendulum where it's spinning clockwise, then anti-clockwise. Now if I just take out a couple of steps, just to give it a slightly more syncopated rhythm, and then if you start putting these direction changes in less regular spots, you start getting some really interesting melodic patterns developing. Let's just add some drums to this. So depending on where you space out these direction changes and how many of them you put in the bar, you get these quite complicated patterns dancing around the grid. So just with a couple of these steps you get this pattern that's kind of constantly evolving. Now, the Moskwa doesn't have a transpose input, but you can transpose the sequence by taking the CV output into a precision adder, like the one at the top of the palette case here, and then adding offset voltages to it. So I've got the beat step set up again with the sequencer channel outputting voltages this time from the CV output. I've got it muted at the moment, but I've got 4 steps here which will add different amounts of voltage to different points within the pattern. I've got it looping over 2 bars. So if I unmute this, just going up a 4th and then a 5th, and then back again. And again, if we take a couple of steps out, sometimes nice to play with the pitch of that last step. Let's just go up an octave on the final step, so on that 13. And again, if we make this loop a little bit shorter as well, suddenly gets a lot more complex. So something to consider is you don't have to have this sequence playing constantly. What I've got going on here is another output from Pamela's new workout going into the transport input. So whenever that input gets a high gate, it pauses. So I've got that running for 75% of a bar, and the last beat, it'll play 4 notes of this sequence. I've got it set to a 7-note loop, so it's going to be slightly different each time. And I've got some drums from the beat step, and I've got rings set up with some chords. So in this case, the sequence is just giving us a nice little occasional melody. You could also take this a step further by accelerating these little bursts and speeding up the clock. Not sure how well it works with this particular track, but you get the idea. What I've got set up here is similar-ish to the first patch. I've actually got two voices configured. You're already hearing one of them at the moment. This is the Xaoc going through the Journal Filter 8, doing a fairly passable 303 impression. But the Moskwa pitch CV is going into the Xaoc as well as rings. The gate, however, I'm running through the Brancher app in Ornament and Crime in Hemisphere Suite. That's basically a clone of Mutable Instruments Branches, which takes an incoming gate and then decides, via a probability, which of two outputs to send the gate to. At the moment, it's 100% output B, so Xaoc's envelope is getting all those gates. If I was to adjust that probability, then some of them would start being fed into the nano rings. So let's just put some drums in. And if I start adjusting this probability, you'll start to hear some notes from rings. So that's about 50-50. You can gradually move over to just the rings part. This can be quite a nice way to divide a single sequence between two voices. Rather than crossfading the audio, you're actually picking out individual notes from the sequence and morphing between them that way. Of course, that percentage parameter as well can be modulated. You could have an LFO to gradually kind of sweep from one voice to the other bit by bit, and it'll, using the random percentages, kind of gradually turn from one sequence into the other. Okay, so for this patch, I'm again using two voices being played by the one sequencer. You're only hearing one at the moment. That's the EN129 with a pulse wave through the filter 8. I'm just going to leave that playing. But I've taken another copy of the CV and gate output of the sequencer, and I'm running the gate through a clock divider, and I'm running the pitch CV through a sample and hold to play a second voice, which you'll hear in a minute. That's the Xaoc through an LPG. Now at the moment I've got the clock divider set to the same, so it's the same sequence. It's a slightly different voice. Now if I change that clock division to divide by 2, you'll see it's playing every second note of the sequence. And because I'm sampling and holding the pitches, we're not getting the pitch changing in between the steps. If I divide by 3, it'll play every third note. So if I bring the other sequence back in, now got two sequences effectively derived from the same one. That's every fifth note. It can be quite nice to have a second part playing a kind of more sustained sound less regularly. Let's try divide by 7. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show you is something a little bit more experimental, and that's to turn the sequencer into an oscillator. If you think about it, the CV output is basically a series of step voltages, so if we were to run it fast enough, it would become an audio waveform, effectively. Luckily, the Moskwa can take an external clock up to audio rate, so what I've done is set up a square wave out of this utility oscillator from IntelliGel up here. At the moment it's in VCO mode at the lowest possible rate. I've got the audio, the CV output of Moskwa going straight into the audio interface, so there's nothing else connected. It's not playing yet, and I've set the first step to maximum, second step to minimum. I've set the CV output to bipolar, so it'll go above and below 0 like an audio waveform would. And if I start the sequencer going, it's going to start playing what's effectively a square wave, not a perfect one, you can see on the scope. If I bring the pitch up slightly, or bring up the rate of the clock, see it's a kind of not perfect, quite digital sounding square wave. Another thing you can do is I've got slew enabled in all the steps here. If I increase the slew on the sequencer, on the sequencer, that kind of slows the rise and fall times and turns it into a triangle. Not a bad. You can hear lots of little digital artifacts which are quite cool. Now this is just the first 2 steps. If I bring in some more. So depending on how regularly it repeats, that'll determine the frequency of it. At the moment it's a kind of sub-frequency of the main frequency of the controlling oscillator here. You can also double it by the clock multiplier in here. I mean, then we could use these knobs to sort of dial in a shape that's a bit more stepped. It takes a bit of trial and error to find things that are useful. But you see there on the scope, it's start slewing it, you get some slightly crazier shapes. There's also no reason why you can't, of course, just treat this like any other oscillator at this point. So if I take a pitch CV from a keyboard into the pitch, take the gate into an envelope, stick that envelope into an LPG, take our sequencer audio output into the input of that LPG, and let's just go back to the original 2 steps, which are a bit easier to control. Maximum, minimum, no slew. Bring the clock down slightly. So now when I press a key on the keyboard, it should open the LPG. Pitch tracking goes a little bit weird at high frequencies, but it's basically playable down here. So there you have it, a kind of playable, strange digital oscillator made out of a sequencer. That's about it for today. I hope you've enjoyed these ideas. Hope it's given you some inspiration to use in your own patches. As usual, like and subscribe, leave a comment below. I'll be back again soon. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.